Each encounter holds a hidden truth. Every investigation demands clarity. Empowering your legal rights, uncovering pure justice.
You need to leave, now.
What? I'm just having coffee.
Manager says you're making people uncomfortable, you're trespassing.
I bought this coffee 10 minutes ago. I'm not bothering anyone.
Are you leaving or do I need to remove you?
You're making a mistake. FBI, Special
I don't
Agent
care
Monroe.
if you're the president, you're leaving.
She was sitting outside a coffee shop on a sunny afternoon, with a coffee on the table and her phone beside it, doing absolutely nothing wrong. Her arms were crossed not out of aggression, but with the specific posture of someone who has already understood what is happening and decided they are not going to pretend everything is fine. The expression on her face was not one of fear. It was the expression of someone who recognizes a situation they have seen before, who knows exactly what is being communicated by the simple fact of having been approached, and who is making a very precise calculation about how to respond. The camera of whoever was on the other side of the scene kept recording, and that recording would become, in the weeks that followed, the central document of a process that would cost an officer the career he had built over years. What had happened before that moment at the coffee shop was simple and common in the way certain things are common without ever being acceptable. A black woman had arrived at that cafe, had ordered her drink, had chosen an outdoor table where the sun was warm and the street noise created the kind of background sound that makes a public place paradoxically conducive to concentration. She had opened her phone, had begun working, and had stayed there like any other customer that afternoon. She had done nothing that drew attention. She had caused no disturbance of any kind. She had simply existed in that space in the most ordinary way possible. And that, for reasons the officer who approached her was never able to articulate convincingly, had been enough for someone to decide she needed to be questioned. The woman sitting at that table was named Agent Sandra Cole. She had 13 years of service with the FBI, had spent a significant portion of that time in operations that required the kind of training most people will never need, and was at that specific coffee shop on that specific afternoon because the regional field office was 4 blocks away, and that place had become, over the preceding months, an informal extension of her workspace. She knew the staff by name. They knew her order. It was the kind of place where a person becomes a regular without that requiring any explanation or justification beyond returning frequently enough. But none of that was visible to whoever arrived that afternoon, looking at her with that specific energy of someone who had decided there was a problem before having any evidence that there was one. The officer who approached Sandra's table worked in a patrol unit that covered that commercial stretch of the city. He had received, according to the account he would give later, a call from a coffee shop employee reporting a customer who was causing discomfort. That account was never substantiated by any concrete evidence. No call record, no employee statement corroborating the version that there had been any kind of disturbance before the police arrived. What existed was an officer who had arrived at a coffee shop, had seen Sandra sitting outside, and had made a decision about that scene before exchanging a single word with her. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story has more layers than appear in the first few minutes, and what it reveals about how certain assumptions function in practice will stay with you long after you finish watching. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been treated as a suspect in a place where you were a customer? Tell me down below. The camera that recorded that scene at the coffee shop was not a security camera installed in the establishment. It was Sandra's phone, which she had begun recording a few seconds after realizing what was happening, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that documentation is protection. That recording, made on a device that was sitting on that table next to the coffee she had purchased like any other customer, captured every second of what happened next. And what happened next revealed, with a clarity that no verbal account could fully replicate, that the officer who had arrived at that coffee shop that afternoon had made a mistake that the camera would make impossible to undo. Sandra had arrived at that coffee shop at 2:17 in the afternoon, according to the purchase record in the loyalty application she regularly used at that establishment. That detail, which would seem irrelevant under any other circumstance, would become part of the evidence record that the attorneys assembled in the weeks that followed, because it documented with time-stamp precision that she had arrived as a customer, had purchased a drink, and had occupied an outdoor table in the same way that any other person does when they choose to sit in the sun on a mild winter afternoon. She had worked for just over 40 minutes before the officer appeared. 40 minutes during which no employee had approached her to complain about anything. No other customer had shown any kind of discomfort, and the afternoon had continued with that quiet normalcy of places where nothing extraordinary is happening. The officer's name was Officer Dennis Hartley. He had 11 years of service, had received several commendations over the course of his career for quick responses in risk situations, and had also accumulated 3 formal complaints in the last 4 years, none of which had resulted in significant disciplinary consequences. That history, which would only become relevant after Sandra's case came to light, painted the portrait of someone the system had repeatedly protected from the consequences of his own actions, the kind of institutional protection that exists in silence until a case with sufficiently clear evidence makes that silence unsustainable. Hartley had arrived at the coffee shop without sirens, had parked the patrol car on the side of the parking lot, and had walked to the outdoor area with the posture of someone evaluating a situation they had already classified before arriving. When Hartley approached Sandra's table, she had already noticed his presence. This is one of the things that field training in federal agencies produces almost inevitably, a constant, peripheral awareness of the immediate environment that does not switch off when you are not on duty. Sandra had seen Hartley park, had seen his trajectory toward the outdoor area, and had picked up her phone and begun recording before he reached the table, with a naturalness the camera captured as the gesture of someone who is not afraid, but who understands that what is about to happen needs to be documented. That decision, made in less than 10 seconds, would be the one that mattered most in the end. Hartley reached the table and asked Sandra to identify herself and explain what she was doing there. There was no greeting, none of the conversational openings that transform a police approach into an interaction between human beings rather than an interrogation. There was only the direct demand, delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to that demand being met without question. Sandra responded calmly that she was a customer of the establishment, that she had purchased a drink, and that she was working. She pointed to the cup on the table as evidence of the first point, and to her phone as evidence of the second. It was a complete, truthful response that should have ended that interaction right there. But Hartley did not move. What followed was a conversation that lasted just over 8 minutes and that Sandra's camera captured in its entirety. Hartley kept pressing, asking for identification documents, questioning why she was at that specific table, asking how long she intended to stay. Each question had that characteristic structure of approaches that have no legal justification, but that sustain themselves on the premise that the person on the other side will yield out of discomfort or fear before the lack of justification needs to be explained. Sandra did not yield. She answered each question with the economical precision of someone who knows the law well enough to know exactly what she is required to answer and what she is not, and who has no intention of providing more information than strictly necessary to someone with no legal basis for asking those questions. It was at some point during that stretch of the conversation that Sandra mentioned for the first time that she was a federal agent. She did not say it as a threat or as an attempt to intimidate Hartley. She said it as relevant information, the way someone provides context, when context can change the trajectory of a situation, developing unnecessarily. Hartley's reaction to that information was captured by the camera with a clarity that Sandra's attorneys would later describe as the most revealing moment of the entire recording, because he did not back down, did not apologize, did not do any of the things most people would do upon discovering they had approached a federal agent without justification. He asked her to prove what she had said, and when Sandra began reaching for the wallet where she kept her FBI credentials, Hartley asked her to stand up from the chair. Sandra stood up from the chair with a deliberate slowness that the camera captured as the movement of someone being absolutely careful with every gesture, because they understand that anything can be misinterpreted, and that the recording is the only objective record of what is happening. She had spent 13 years in an agency that trains its agents extensively on how to behave in risk situations, on how to maintain composure when pressure is at its maximum, and on how never to give the person on the other side any element that can be used to justify an escalation. That training was working in that moment in a way that Hartley had clearly not anticipated, because Sandra was doing something that unbalanced him without her needing to raise her voice or make a single abrupt movement. She was being completely, absolutely, undeniably cooperative within the exact limits of what the law required, and within those limits, there was nothing he could use. When Sandra presented her FBI credentials, the camera captured the moment Hartley examined them. He held the document in his hands long enough to read what was written. verify the photo, and process what it meant. That interval lasted perhaps 15 seconds in the recording, and those 15 seconds would be analyzed repeatedly by Sandra's legal team in the weeks that followed, because what happened after them revealed something about Hartley that went beyond that specific incident. A person who had approached someone without justification and then discovered they were approaching a federal agent would, in most reasonable scenarios, have acknowledged the mistake and ended the interaction. Hartley did not do that. He returned the credentials and said he still needed Sandra to leave the establishment because he had received a complaint about her. That moment was the point at which the recording became something more than a record of harassment. It became the record of a decision made with full knowledge of who was on the other side, which fundamentally changed the nature of what was being documented. Until the moment Hartley saw the credentials, there was the possibility, however small, of arguing that he simply did not know who he was dealing with, and that the error was the result of incomplete information. After he saw the credentials and continued, that possibility disappeared completely. What the camera captured from that point forward was no longer an officer acting out of ignorance. It was an officer acting by choice, with complete information, in a direction that the recorded evidence would make very difficult to defend. Sandra asked for Hartley's name and identification number with the same calm she had maintained throughout the entire interaction. He provided the information with a hesitation the camera recorded, not as a dramatic pause, but as the kind of hesitation that exists when someone is beginning to realize, too late, that the situation is not going in the direction they had imagined. Sandra noted the information on her phone without rushing any movement, carefully folded the paper napkin that was on the table, disposed of her coffee in the nearest trash can, put her phone in her jacket pocket without ending the recording, and left the coffee shop with the posture of someone who was not retreating, but who was simply choosing the battlefield more carefully than that parking lot allowed. The camera kept recording inside the pocket for a few more seconds, capturing only ambient sound, and then was ended. What happened in the hours following that exit from the coffee shop moved with a speed that Hartley had certainly not calculated when he asked Sandra to stand up from the chair. She arrived at the FBI field office 4 blocks away, went directly to her supervisor, and reported the incident with the same clinical precision with which she had answered Hartley's questions. She had left the coffee shop, but had brought with her every second of that interaction, recorded in a video file that was now being transferred from her phone to the office's secure server. The supervisor listened to the account, watched the recording, and immediately did 2 things. The first was to contact the police department with formal notification of the incident. The second was to forward the file to the FBI's legal department, which had specific protocols for situations involving harassment of federal agents on or off duty. The formal notification reached the police department that same afternoon, signed with the FBI's official letterhead and containing a detailed description of the incident, Hartley's name and identification number as provided by him during the interaction, and a copy of the recording Sandra had made. The department chief received that document at 5:43 in the afternoon, according to the official correspondence entry log. He had left before any response was formulated, but members of his team who saw the document that afternoon described the reaction as the kind of silence that settles when everyone in a room simultaneously understands that something is about to become very complicated. The recording had reached the department, and the recording left no room for any alternative version of what had happened at that coffee shop that afternoon. The internal investigation was opened the following morning, 48 hours earlier than the department's standard protocol would normally require. That speed was not the result of a genuine impulse toward transparency. It was the result of a call the department chief had received early that morning from a representative of the FBI's regional field office who had been very clear about the level of institutional attention the case was receiving and about the expectations regarding the speed of the response. When a federal agency calls a municipal police department in that specific tone, internal priorities reorganize in a way that purely internal processes rarely produce. The investigation was opened. A senior investigator was assigned, and Hartley was notified that same morning that he was under investigation and that he should appear for a formal interview that afternoon. Hartley's interview lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. He arrived accompanied by a police union representative, which was his right and was also a clear signal that he understood the gravity of what he was facing. His version of events followed the structure that defense versions in cases like this tend to follow. He had received a complaint, had responded professionally, had asked for identification in a standard manner, and had requested that the customer leave the establishment after verifying that there was a dispute between her and the coffee shop management. Each of those points had a fundamental problem, and the problem was the same in every case. The recording showed something different, not different in interpretation, not different depending on angle or context, different in the facts, the sequence, and the words used. The investigator assigned to the case was a man named Lieutenant Morrison, with 23 years of service and a reputation within the department for being the kind of professional who does not shape investigation conclusions to protect colleagues. When the evidence points in an inconvenient direction, he had watched Sandra's recording 3 times before Hartley's interview, had noted the timestamps of every relevant moment, and had formulated specific questions about each point where Hartley's version diverged from what the camera showed. When those questions were asked during the interview, Hartley's inability to respond consistently with the recording was documented in the interview record itself, creating a second evidence file that added to the first without either party needing to make any additional argument. The facts were contradicting themselves on their own. The police department had requested, through the appropriate formal channels, access to the call records from the day of the incident to verify whether any call had actually been made from the coffee shop reporting a disruptive customer. The result of that inquiry arrived 2 days after Hartley's interview and was the kind of information that, when it arrives, drastically simplifies the analysis of a case that until then could have been characterized as word against word. There was no record of any call from the coffee shop to the emergency number or to any police line that day in the period before Hartley's arrival. There was no record of any internal communication in the department's system documenting the receipt of a complaint before the approach. The complaint that had justified the entire operation simply did not exist in any verifiable record. That detail transformed the case in a fundamental way. Until that point, there was the theoretical possibility that Hartley had acted on genuine information, even if misinterpreted or exaggerated. The absence of any complaint record eliminated that possibility and placed a far more serious question at the center of the investigation. What had motivated the approach if there was no real complaint? The most obvious answer, and the one the recording supported visually in a fairly clear manner, was that Hartley had seen Sandra sitting outside the coffee shop and had made a decision about that scene based on something that was not a complaint, was not an observable behavior justifying intervention, and was not any of the objective criteria that should guide a police approach. It was an assumption, and that assumption had very specific characteristics that the investigation was now formally documenting. The police union entered Hartley's defense with full force as soon as the scope of the investigation began to become clear. Union representatives made public statements about the department's commitment to protecting its members, about the importance of ensuring that investigations were conducted without external political pressure, and about the risk that the FBI's presence as an interested party in the case compromised the impartiality of the process. Those statements were the kind of defensive move that police unions execute with precision when they realize the evidence is not on the side of the member they are protecting, and that the only available ground is procedural ground. There was no argument about the facts because the facts were recorded. There were only arguments about how the facts should be treated, and those arguments were being made in an increasingly urgent tone that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that the union knew Hartley's position was far more fragile than the public statement suggested. The civil lawsuit was filed 6 weeks after the incident, at a moment deliberately chosen by Sandra's legal team to maximize the impact of what was being presented. The department's internal investigation was still formally ongoing, which meant the civil lawsuit reached the public sphere before the department had had the opportunity to produce any conclusion that could be used to frame the narrative favorably for the institution. That sequence had been calculated. Sandra and her attorneys had understood from the beginning that one of their most important assets was control over timing, and that using that control intelligently was as important as the quality of the evidence itself, which was already considerable. The lawsuit named Hartley individually, and the department as an institution, and the allegations were constructed in layers that reinforced each other in a way that made each one harder to refute than it would have been in isolation. The first layer was the most direct: discriminatory harassment based on race, documented by the recording that showed an approach without objective justification against a customer who was exercising a right that any other customer present at that coffee shop that afternoon was exercising without any intervention. The second layer was more specific and more serious from the standpoint of potential consequences. Interference with a federal agent in the exercise of her duties. Because Sandra was not merely off-duty that afternoon, she was, as the recording and context made clear, in a period between work engagements and the coffee shop, was functionally part of her operational environment, given that the office was 4 blocks away. The third layer was the one the department's attorneys feared most, because it was the one that transformed Hartley's individual case into an institutional matter of far greater magnitude. That allegation argued that the documented history of 3 prior complaints against Hartley, none of which had resulted in real disciplinary consequences, established a pattern of behavior that the department had systematically ignored, and that pattern of supervisory negligence created direct institutional liability for what had happened at that coffee shop. In legal language, that argument has a specific name, and when supported with sufficient evidence, it represents one of the most solid pathways to establishing an institution's responsibility for the acts of its members that go beyond what a single agent acting alone could create. The department's attorneys responded to the lawsuit with unusual speed, which was itself an indicator of the level of internal concern. They argued qualified immunity for Hartley, operational discretion to justify the approach, and attempted to frame the history of prior complaints as evidence of a system functioning correctly rather than of a system failing to hold a problematic agent accountable. Each of those arguments had a prepared response from Sandra's attorneys, and the responses had been prepared in advance because the arguments were predictable. When you know the history of how police departments respond to civil lawsuits with video evidence, you know 3 to 4 moves in advance what the defense will present, and you prepare the responses before the arguments are made. The recording was the center of everything throughout the preliminary proceedings. It was presented at every hearing as primary evidence, and each time the department attempted to create distance between Hartley and the allegations using abstract language about procedure and operational discretion, Sandra's attorneys returned to the video. Specific frame, specific timestamp, specific observable behavior that contradicts the abstract allegation being made. That strategy of anchoring each abstract legal argument in a concrete and verifiable moment from the recording was described by legal observers following the case as one of the most methodically effective approaches they had seen in similar cases, because it made it virtually impossible for any judge or jury to separate the legal arguments from the visual evidence that supported or refuted them. The pressure the case was generating outside the courtroom ran parallel to the pressure being built inside it. Civil rights organizations had formally endorsed Sandra's position. Groups of federal agents from racial minorities had issued statements about the broader pattern the case represented. Investigative journalists had begun researching Hartley's full history and the 3 prior complaints the department had filed without consequences, and the results of that research were beginning to appear in publications the department could not ignore. The police union had escalated its defense rhetoric to a level that was creating its own public relations problem because the intensity of defending an agent whose actions were recorded on video communicated something about the institutions, priorities that many people were noticing and commenting on. The department was being pressured from every direction simultaneously, and every week that passed without a resolution made the position harder to sustain. The agreement was announced on a Thursday morning, 4 months after that afternoon at the coffee shop. The document was 21 pages long and had been negotiated over 6 weeks of conversations that, according to sources close to the proceedings, had been significantly more tense than typical agreements of this kind tend to be, because the department had entered the negotiations still trying to preserve Hartley's job through some combination of suspension, demotion, or transfer that would allow the outcome to be called accountability without having to reach dismissal. Sandra had rejected each of those configurations with the same consistency with which she had answered Hartley's questions at that coffee shop, within the exact limits of what she considered acceptable, and with no willingness to move those limits to facilitate an exit that did not reflect the real weight of what had been done. Hartley was dismissed as a condition of the agreement, not transferred, not suspended for a fixed period, not demoted to an administrative role where he would continue receiving a salary while the case cooled in public memory. Dismissed with loss of the police certification he had accumulated over 11 years, which in practice ended any possibility of continuing a career in law enforcement in any jurisdiction with access to the state certification record. The union attempted to reverse that condition until the last possible moment of the negotiations, arguing that dismissal was disproportionate for a first formal incident. Sandra's attorneys responded that the 3 prior complaints filed without consequences made that incident the 4th in a pattern, not the first in an isolated deviation, and that the agreement should reflect the complete pattern and not only the episode that had finally been documented with sufficient evidence to not be ignored. The financial value of the agreement was kept confidential by a negotiated clause, but the institutional conditions were made public as part of a requirement Sandra had insisted be included. She had argued through her attorneys that agreements closed entirely in secrecy serve primarily the interest of the institution that erred because they allow the payment to be treated as an operational cost without any real change in the behaviors that produced the error. Making the institutional conditions public was a way of creating accountability that survived the agreement itself, that existed as a verifiable record independently of any interest the department might have in minimizing what had happened after public attention shifted to another case. The institutional conditions included a complete revision of the approach protocol in public commercial spaces with documented objective criteria that needed to be satisfied before any intervention based on a third-party complaint. They also included the creation of a complaint tracking system for individual agents that generated automatic alerts when an agent accumulated more than 2 complaints within a 4-year period, with mandatory supervisory review before the agent could continue in operational roles without additional evaluation. And they included specific training on interactions with agents from other public safety agencies, federal or state, with emphasis on identification and verification protocols that should be activated immediately when an agent identifies themselves as federal during an approach. Sandra gave a single interview after the agreement was finalized to the news outlet that had covered the case with the most depth from the beginning. She spoke for less than 15 minutes, without notes, and what she said was remarkable, not for its intensity, but for its precision. She did not describe the agreement as a personal victory. She described it as a data point in a much larger set that still needed many more points before any optimistic conclusion about systemic change could be sustained. She said she had recorded that interaction at the coffee shop because she had learned, over 13 years of service in a federal agency, that documentation is the only protection that works consistently when the other protective structures fail. And she said she had fought until a dismissal and not until a suspension, because suspensions end and then the person comes back, and the person who comes back is the same person who was there before, with the same history and the same assumptions, just more careful about choosing when to let them show. There is one final detail in this story that is not in the legal documents or the public statements, but that circulated among the people who followed the case closely, and that says something about the nature of what Sandra had faced at that coffee shop. After the agreement was finalized and Hartley's name entered the public record as a dismissed officer, 2 of the coffee shop employees who had been working that afternoon gave voluntary statements to an investigative journalist. They said there had been no complaint, that Sandra was a regular customer who had never caused any problem, that she had arrived, had ordered her usual coffee, had sat at her usual table, and had stayed working as she always did. And that, when Hartley had arrived and approached her, they had watched from the window, not understanding why, because from their perspective, there was absolutely nothing happening at that table that justified the presence of a police officer. They had not said so before because no one had asked. Sandra's camera had made the question unnecessary. But when they finally spoke, what they said was the simplest and most complete confirmation of something the recording had already proven, that on that afternoon, at a sunny coffee shop, on an ordinary day, the only thing that had drawn Hartley's attention had been Sandra, and Sandra had simply been having coffee.
Fairness is an enduring mission, and insight serves as your safeguard. Thank you for watching and advocating for absolute clarity.